Hi class, welcome to week 4 of your online course. This week is racial justice, and before I get going with explaining some of the readings, I just wanted to apologize for my absence last week and being able to post a new video. I had a medical emergency and unfortunately ended up in the hospital, and then on Friday I had to go back into the hospital and I had emergency surgery. I'm doing okay and I'm recovering. But that's why there was no video from me now. So you have the video from the last time I taught this course last summer. And yeah, so here I am back. So the first reading that you have for this week is What My Bike Has Taught Me About White Privilege, and this goes along with understanding white privilege. And while you're reading this, I want you to think about whether you agree with the author on if this is enough, if white privilege, naming this as white privilege is enough, or if elevating the discussion to really talking about white supremacy and white supremacist culture is necessary. The second thing that you're going to be watching actually is a video on microaggressions, and it's a really great video. I'm not going to go into explaining it so that you can watch it. The third reading is Nice and Racist, What Ellen DeGeneres Teaches Us About Racism. This is by a blog group called the Kinfolk Collective, and this reading is particularly important because something that is often discussed when discussing racial justice in justice studies is the need for racism to be intentional. And this is something that's perpetuated also in the legal system in the United States, that there has to be some sort of intent behind the words or behind the actions to make it racist, that things can't be racist if the person didn't intend them to be. And that's simply not the case. And this article does a really great job of explaining why intent isn't necessary for something to be racist, that being racist is part of a larger systemic issue of oppression based off of assigned categories of skin color or ethnicity or phenotypical parts of our how we present our bodies. You're then going to be reading the racist housing policy that made your neighborhood. This is about redlining, which you read about last week as well in the Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And this is really interesting, and this is one of the options that you had when you're writing your discussion board posts is on discussing the redlining that existed in your neighborhood or in another neighborhood if you can't find the maps for your own, and comparing it to this really awesome project that's being done called the Racial Dot Map, which takes census statistics and puts a dot for the race of each person and where they live. And one of the discussion board post options is to look at those two different maps and compare them and see how much has changed or how little has changed in your own neighborhood, about how your neighborhood was constructed intentionally, potentially to leave out people of color. This changes on who was left out depending on where you live. In Arizona, we had the things that allowed for racism within this housing policy are called restrictive covenants, and they are built to exclude particular communities of color. In Arizona, ours were built to exclude African American and Black individuals, Native Americans, they are usually designated as Indians in the actual restrictive covenants that were placed on these homes, and then the Latino community. So that's really interesting. I want you to look at what you're doing, what your neighborhood was built like, and what your neighborhood might be doing now to end some of those racist housing policies that built it. You're also going to be reading A Time to Be Freed by Rashad Thomas. He's a graduate of the Justice Studies Department and a poet. And he is one of the co-founders of the Gutta Collective, which is a poetry collective in Phoenix. And you're going to be reading or listening to a song by Billie Holiday called Strange Fruit, which is brought up in Rashad's poem as well. So now we're going to move to Regarding the Pain of Others by Susan Sontag, and I want to talk a little bit about why I decided to include this in the Racial Justice Week. And this is because, particularly in the last few years, we've had a lot of video footage that has surfaced regarding racial injustice in the United States. This particularly started catalyzing around the time that Mike Brown was shot in Ferguson, shot and killed by a police officer. And then the videos have really just continued and continued. And this is not exclusive to videos of police shootings in the United States, although that's such a prominent situation where that's happening. But we also see it with refugees, seeing what they're going through in their attempt to transition to safer communities from their own, what's happening to them before they're able to move out of their unsafe areas. And when you're with all of the assault of this media that comes onto us daily through Facebook, through Twitter, through TV, through Instagram even, it's really important to consider what's happening in our brains when we're taking in these images, how these images are chosen, why they're being made, who's making them, who's taking the photographs, what their purposes are, because every time somebody takes a photograph of anything, they're choosing what to leave out, what to keep in, what exact instance they're taking a photo of, why they're taking a photo of that person. They're incorporating all of their positionality and biases into the selection of when they take that photograph. And this chapter really starts that conversation and gets you to start thinking about what you're doing when you're consuming these images on a daily basis. So there's a couple of really great quotes from this chapter. So the first one is, "And photographs of the victims of war are themselves a species of rhetoric. They reiterate, they simplify, they agitate, they create the illusion of consensus." So again, this is Susan Sontag speaking to the reality that these photographs are used as rhetoric. They're used as arguments. They can either inculcate your ideas, they can further embed them, they can challenge them, they can do all sorts of things, but you need to be critical when you're looking at them. And she also writes that no we should be taken for granted when the subject is looking at other people's pain. And so there's a lot of this discussion of we when we're all looking at these photographs, but it's important to remember that experiences are different based off of location and based off of positionality. And that when we are consuming these images, to think in a we format can be damaging sometimes to those who are the subjects of those photographs. This is not something that's new. This is not something new in the 21st century, although, like I said, it's been especially prominent recently, especially concerning police brutality. But Susan Sontag in this chapter really talks about how we've, throughout, as soon as we were able to, we've always used images to look at people's pain from a distance. And she writes that, quote, "There are many uses of the innumerable opportunities a modern life supplies for regarding, at a distance, other people's pain. Photographs of an atrocity may give rise to opposing responses, a call for peace, a cry for revenge, or simply the bemused awareness, continually restocked by photographic information, that terrible things happen." And so this is something that results from looking at that pain from a distance. And this is when I really want to get into what I want to talk to you about, which is witnessing versus voyeurism. And these images can lead to either, right? Depending on how you're approaching them and engaging them. So one can feel obliged to look at photographs that record great cruelties and crimes. One should feel obliged to think about what it means to look at them, about the capacity actually to assimilate what they show. So you need to think about what it means when you're taking in these images that seem so commonplace now. And if you're critical about it, you can witness instead of be a voyeur. So I want to distinguish what that means. So voyeurism stops at the act of watching. That means that you just take it in. It's kind of like what Sontag just said, where you just look at them and you kind of just know that terrible things happen, and that's what you get from it. Whereas bearing witness goes beyond just watching. It means you're looking, listening, responding, asking questions about it, acknowledging differences and privilege and taking in that image versus being a subject of it, and responding to it really with love and with communion with humankind, not just understanding that terrible things happen, but understanding how all of us are implicated in terrible things that happen and figuring out what we can each do about it. That's really what the poems read are about today that you're reading, and the song lyrics. I really encourage you to look at the story behind Strange Fruit, to see who wrote it, to look at what the message was, why he wrote it, and the subject of it. It's a very powerful song. It's been redone many times. There's an entire book about the song. And I just hope this week that you can take some time to reflect on what images you're taking in, how you're responding to them, and how you're trying to understand and incorporate what you're witnessing, hopefully instead of being a voyeur, into your own life. So I look forward to going to get your outlines back to you as soon as possible, and I look forward to seeing all that you have to write this week about racial justice.